Okay, so as we're gonna get started, the first thing we're gonna do is a little wet into wet. I'm gonna show you that in this square here. So when you're working wet into wet, you're gonna apply your water to your board. And the beauty of watercolor is you can get the paint to do things that you really can't do with other media. And then kind of look at that in the light to see if there's any little spots you missed. I missed some at the top there. Okay. Then you can dab a little more water on just to make sure you have a nice saturated surface. And then as you're working, make sure you don't leave your brushes in your water. It's just a good rule of thumb because they can get bent as they sit in there. So as you're working, just dab your brush off, and then I like to just set it on the towel. And we can use a little of this Cad Red that we took out of the tube from before and make a little pool of water. And you're just gonna grab a tiny bit of paint. And then I'm looking at that, it's not quite saturated enough, so I'm gonna grab a little more. Okay, that's looking good. So when you're working wet into wet, you can get beautiful blooms and bleeds as the paint spreads in the water. And again, with watercolor, you can get the paint to do things like this. So as you're thinking of your compositions, you can think of a method, if a method like this would benefit the composition you're working on. So I'm gonna add another color to this now. Let's see. So now in my other palette, I'm gonna activate some of this blue here. And so adding some more color, and you can let it do its thing. If you want to get a more flat coverage, you can use your larger brush, working wet into wet, and spread the color more evenly. Grab some phthalo here. That more vibrant. And if you're working with tape, you can go right up to the edges, and as it dries, it'll give a nice crisp edge for you. I'll show you the salt while this is nice and wet. So this is the kosher flake salt. You can just sprinkle that on there. And what happens is the salt grabs the pigment, and then as it dries, it creates some really beautiful star-like effects in the paint. You can also use regular table salt. So we'll let that dry. Okay. The other thing with watercolor as you're working is being patient. So if you're working with a certain color, so let's say we're gonna work with some blue. This is wet onto dry. So you can see the difference between pre-wetting your surface and then applying paint directly to your watercolor board. Now, there might be times where you want your colors to bleed one into another. So while this is still wet, I'm gonna grab some of this lemony yellow here and add some directly right by it. And as you can see, the yellow immediately starts grabbing that blue, and you can get that nice blended edge, and it's gonna bleed one into another. So again, thinking about what you want your paint to do. If you want a blended edge like that, then that's a happy effect. There might be a time though where you don't want your colors blending one into another. And so I'll show you that on this edge. So we're gonna let that edge dry, and here you can see that beautiful blend that happens when you put wet paint against wet paint. Another thing you're gonna learn working with watercolors is some colors are stainers and some colors are lifters. And what that means, ultramarine is a really lovely lifter. So ultramarine is this nice, beautiful, deep blue. And a color that lifts means you can come back later with water and a paper towel and literally lift the color right off. So let's say I got some paint where I didn't want it. So I'm gonna reactivate that surface there and blot squarely and evenly with a paper towel. And as you can see, you can lift most of that color off, even after it's dried. Or if you want a polka dot effect or certain areas lifted off, you can come back with water on ultramarine and really it lifts quite well. Other colors, such as our cad red here, are stainers, and they're gonna be on there for good. So you can run some tests to see what you wanna do as you move forward. The other thing I wanted to show you is there's a couple ways you can work with watercolor where you can go light to dark or dark to light. And again, with this, we're gonna need to let it dry. So this leaf, I'm gonna do light to dark. This leaf is gonna be dark to light. So light to dark, you're gonna start with your lightest values and add. So let's say you wanna have a nice bright yellow where the light is shining and making highlights on this little leaf. And then we're gonna let that dry. The watercolors have a beautiful transparent nature, so you can layer upon layer upon layer. Now for this leaf, I'm gonna work dark to light. So let's add some deep ultramarine to these areas where we want the shadows to be, and then we're gonna let that dry. Okay, so we're gonna let that part dry. Now let's say here on this light to dark leaf, I want a little bit of a bleeding effect. So while that yellow is still wet, I'm gonna add a tiny bit of light green here and there, just so it blends in with that yellow a bit. Okay, and then we're gonna let that dry. Another effect you might want to get with watercolor is a gradiated wash. One method of that, so let's see, we can go back to our cad red here. So you want to begin with enough color for the surface that you're going to work with. Use this other brush and get some of this, add a little more water. Okay, so one method for a gradiated wash is to make a stroke, and without reapplying any color to your brush, because it's very well saturated, you're gonna do a semi-dip in your water, run against the edge, and then you're gonna run that brush that's been watered down just a little bit right again. And then you keep repeating that process. So a little bit of a dip, a little bit of a scrape on the edge of your jar, and while the paint is still wet, adding another stripe. And you keep going with that process until your brush essentially has very little water left on it. Or excuse me, very little paint left on it. And you're gonna get some variation, which is okay. There's a place for making things absolutely perfect, perhaps in the computer. With the watercolor process, it's kind of nice to give yourself room to let the paint bleed and fade and do what it's so good at doing. And you can even do one more layer. Okay. And while the paint's still wet, you can even tilt your board a little bit and let that run. And then if you see you're getting pooling down in the bottom, like right there, you can very carefully dab that, just so you don't get a bar at the bottom of your gradiated wash. So that's a gradiated wash. Here we have our blue flat wash that's now dry. So this was wet into wet. Now we're gonna do wet into dry. So again, let's grab some alizarin crimson here. If you wanna keep this crisp edge of the blue, you can do so by painting wet over dry, and being careful not to reactivate the paint. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So down here, I'm applying the paint softly and evenly. So we're getting that nice edge, that purple blend. Now, if you want to reblend that edge, because ultramarine is so good at reactivating, you can come in with a pretty clean brush, mostly just water, and reactivate that edge a little bit to make a blend. I'm going to keep it a crisp edge because I think I like that better. So those are some watercolor techniques. And then let's come back to our little leaves here. Okay, so this is still working on drying, but this one's pretty dry. So now I'm gonna take a more vibrant green, but I'm gonna add a little red to it. As you're working with your colors, you want to always alter them a little bit. Using paint right out of the tube is okay, but your colors are gonna be more sophisticated and interesting if you alter them. You can tone them down with the complement, or you can add complementary colors, either complementary or analogous colors, just to alter them so they're not just straight out of the tube. So as you can see, the places where I had the yellow, that yellow is still coming up through, but it's getting toned down a bit by this green I'm applying. And I'm working with a pretty dry brush, meaning I don't have tons of paint on this brush. So I'm able to really control where the paint is going. Okay, now we're gonna let that dry. And now with this leaf, now we're gonna add a little green over that blue just to change the tone. You might do a flat wash over the whole surface. As you can tell, you can do a pretty flat wash in a small space like this, but in a larger space, I recommend using a larger brush. So now we've got that nice flat wash of a middle tone green over that, and we're gonna let that dry. So as you can see, you can work both ways. And then let's say I wanna drop some yellow in there as a bloom. And then you might say, okay, well, that was a little too bright. So the cool thing with watercolor is while it's still very wet, if you do something you're not totally happy with, you can carefully lay your towel over a clean paper towel, rub it very carefully, and you can lift off if you did something you're not totally happy with. Now that lifted off some of my green because it was still wet, but it's a good thing to know. You can still see a tiny bit of that yellow that I had applied, but because I wasn't super happy with the brightness of it, I was able to lift it right off. So I'm gonna come back in here again with the green and then let that dry for a bit. Okay, now this leaf, we can come in with some ultramarine, remixed with a little gray, and then fine tune those shadows. And remember too, as you're working with shadows, with any object, add a little of the complement to the shadow. So if we're working with a green leaf, we would actually put a little red in our shadow, which might seem somewhat counterintuitive, but in the nature of light, that's the way things work, and it will lend a realism to what you're doing. I'm actually going to add a tiny bit of red, even in the shadow portions of this leaf. Okay, so we're going to let that dry for a while. Now I'm going to come in with a more subtle yellow this time, because I felt like that lemon was a little too bright. And I'm going to add that here. And that's still pretty bright, but I think I'm just going to tone it down with green this time. And so let's say you have some pretty saturated color on there. Another technique you can do is clean your brush, come in just with a brush with a little water on it, and move that pigment around and spread it so it's not so concentrated in those spaces, and it'll tone it down a little bit. So there you go. So there's working light to dark, where that yellow underneath shines up through in places. I'm going to tone it down here. Or you can start with your shadows and go lighter as you go. And let's say I want to add a little white highlight over here. I can get a clean brush with just a little water on it and dab some of that paint off. And that'll pull up just a little more of a highlight on that side of the leaf. So you can work in and back out again to some extent with watercolors, just with water and dabbing with a clean paper towel, which will give it a nice dimensionality as you move forward. So those are some watercolor techniques. Hope you enjoyed it. Good luck, guys.